Hello, my name is Nicholas Morton, and in this group of talks I'm going to be covering the decline and fragmentation of the Mongol Empire. And we're going to start by looking at where that fragmentation came from, where that decline came from. Now, there's an important quality to the Mongol Empire, which is that as it expands to encompass so much of Eurasia, that raises the question, how do the Mongols control so much territory? Well, they can solve that to some degree by adopting specific communications approaches. So, for example, the Mongols have something called a fast horse system, which means that on their various major roads of communication, they have various way stations with horses ready to go so that their messengers can gallop 10, 20 miles, change horse, and then get onto a fresh horse and gallop on the next 20 miles or however long it may be. And that helps to facilitate communications, but they are still ruling an empire that encompasses tens of thousands of square miles of territory. So how do they do that? Well, in many ways, Genghis Khan and his descendants, they do it the way that they would traditionally do it, which is that the various different Mongol princes, so Genghis Khan's sons, they get to control different parts of the empire themselves. And there's a key word here, which is Ulu. Now, each Mongol prince is granted an Ulu, which is basically a large area of territory. It's still part of the Mongol Empire. It is still subject to the Great Khan, but it is essentially where they can operate. It's the land that they can traverse around with their own tent city and administer control over. And so this is how the Mongol Empire is sort of broken up. Although it is a bit more complicated than that, because even though you have these various Ulu belonging to each of Genghis Khan's sons and indeed other Mongol leaders as well, the Great Khan also has generals who have conquered these various regions and who retain an interest. And indeed you've got local bureaucrats and administrators who the Mongol Empire has set up to run these areas, and that creates all sorts of lines of tension about where one jurisdiction ends and where one begins. But let's stick to the Ulu for the time being, because that in many ways, the quarrelling over where one Ulu begins and one ends, that will really play a major role in the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire. Now, a key moment in this is that much of Western Eurasia, so that encompasses what we would think of today as the Near East, much of Western Russia and Eastern Europe, that region is controlled by the descendants of Genghis Khan's son, Jochi. And Jochi's son, Batu, and then after Batu it's Berke, and this family controls the Near East, Western Russia and Eastern Europe as we would see them today. And that doesn't really get contested for the first few decades of Mongol rule. But then in 1256, you may remember this from a previous talk, another Mongol leader called Hulagu, who is the son of another of Genghis Khan's sons. So he's the grandson of Genghis Khan. His father was someone called Tule. Hulagu invades into Persia, and as you may remember, he ends up conquering Baghdad and indeed much of Syria. Now, this poses a problem for the Jochid dynasty, which had previously ruled the area as its Ulu, because Hulagu is not from the same Ulu. He is from a different Ulu. Now, initially it seems that the current leader of the Jochid Ulu, called Berke, he was rather hoping that Hulagu would be subordinate to him and would acknowledge his rightful claim as the overlord to Western Eurasia and within that the Near East. Now, at this time, Berke was preparing the ground for a second enormous invasion into Western Christendom. And in 1259, in fact, Berke staged an initial probe into Christendom's eastern borders, preparing for the overthrow of, and when I say Western Christendom, of course I mean essentially Western Europe. But he's also got his eyes focused south as well, because he wants to know what Hulagu's doing. And Hulagu, it seems, has it in mind to create his own empire. He doesn't want to rule the Near East simply as the representative of Berke. He wants to rule it for himself. And so increasingly Hulagu asserts his own independence until in 1260 Hulagu essentially declares Persia, modern-day Iran, and all the lands to the west to be his own empire. And he gives that empire the name the Ilkhans, or the Ilkhanate. Now, think about that from Berke's perspective. And Berke at this point is stationed to the north of the Black Sea. This is an enormous infringement of his authority. He is the overlord of the Near East as far as he's concerned. He has the right to claim the Near East as his Ulu, and yet Hulagu has come in and cordoned this off as his own empire. Now, Hulagu, for his part, he is intent on conquering the Ayyubid Empire, and then in 1260 he suffers a major defeat, you may remember, at the Battle of Ain Jalut, at the hands of the Mamluk Empire. And so Hulagu's real interests at this time are to stage a new invasion into the coastal regions of the Near East, and more specifically to destroy the Mamluk Empire which had defeated him. So let's take a step back from that. In the south you have Hulagu, newly established empire, claimed at the expense of Berke in the north, and preparing itself for a war against the Mamluks. Then in the north you have Berke looking to invade Eastern Europe in force, but also worried and feeling very insulted by Hulagu having carved out his own empire from his own Ulu. Now this is the crucial moment, because suddenly these two empires ceased their wars of expansion. There's never another really big invasion into Eastern Europe, and there is no strike by Hulagu against the Mamluks, because instead these leaders, rather than concentrating on external expansion as their predecessors had for decades, the Mongols turn their armies against each other. And so Berke and Hulagu go to war over who gets to control the Near East. And there's a series of campaigns, a series of really big battles fought in the vicinity of the Caucasus Mountains between these two Mongol empires, trying to see who can defeat the other and therefore claim supreme authority over the Near East. Now this doesn't just disrupt the Mongols' wars of expansion on their eastern borders, this also means that the Mongol Empire is now essentially at war with itself. And that will continue. There's never a rapprochement, there's never a sort of making peace. There's some temporary truces, but from this point on, Berke's Ulu, which becomes known as the Khanate of the Golden Horde, and Hulagu's territories, known as the Ilkhanate, they are almost perpetually at war, or at least they are rivals for the forthcoming decades, and the Mongols' wars of expansion stall on their western frontiers. Swinging over to the east, in China, under Kublai Khan, the Mongols' wars of expansion continue until in 1279 the Mongols complete their invasion and conquest of China, but they have a lot of difficulty invading much further than that. Mongol armies struggle to penetrate much further to the south because they don't operate particularly well in jungle areas or the very mountainous regions of that area. And the Mongols also fail twice in their invasions of Japan. So the Mongol Empire's expansion slows until ultimately it stops. But there's another dimension to this as well, which is that having conquered so much of Eurasia, the various Mongol rulers, whether that's in China, the Near East, or in Central Eurasia, they begin to take on the culture of the various peoples that they've overthrown. And so in China, the Mongols begin to take on an interest in Tibetan Buddhism. In the Near East, the Mongols convert ultimately to Islam, and they also convert to Islam in the Golden Horde as well. But that begins to create differences in the various wings of the Mongol Empire as they take on slightly different cultures as time passes, until ultimately they become just essentially empires in their own right and separate from one another.